Forensic science, I think itself, is a misnomer. Most fields of forensics were developed in police labs or police departments for the purpose of helping police and prosecutors solve crimes. Prosecutors are going to migrate to a doctor who, makes it easier for them to get convictions. The kind of set of skills it takes to persuade a jury are not only are they not consistent with the set of skills it takes to be a good scientist, they're often at odds with one another.
Told you to snap up a modest position of currency meant different factor in digits. Which of you listen? Which of you listen? Which of you listen?
I'm here at the Freecoast Festival in New Hampshire with Radley Balko, who's a journalist for the Washington Post and who received last year's Bastiat Award through Reason Foundation. Thanks so much for chatting with me.
My pleasure.
So we just had a wonderful talk that you gave on the cruise that we went on, and you gave us an overview of some of the things you talked about in your most recent book, and you mainly focused on the issue of forensics. So I wanted you to just give me a little bit of an overview about how our idea and our conception of forensic science can be problematic.
Right, so forensic science, I think itself, is a bit of a misnomer. Most fields of forensics that we know about, or that we know commonly, with the exception of DNA testing, but all the others weren't really developed in scientific laboratories, weren't subjected to scientific inquiry or the scientific method, but were developed in police labs or police departments for the purpose of helping police and prosecutors solve crimes. So most of them aren't really science. They're sort of soft sciences, or they're subjective sciences. There's a huge field of forensics called pattern matching, the pattern matching disciplines, in which an expert sort of looks at one piece of evidence and then looks at another piece of evidence and then just kind of eyeballs it and says either it's a match or it isn't. And that's not a scientific method. It's not to say that that kind of analysis is useless, but it definitely isn't science, and it needs to be sort of relayed to jurors in a way that that helps them understand the limits of that kind of analysis.
What we see in criminal prosecution at the moment, it seems like this very concrete case. You have these expert witnesses brought in, you have people come in and say, well, we based this on forensic science, and generally that's how a lot of people have been sent to jail. But what you've actually done through a lot of research into this area is you've uncovered lots of cases where a lot of innocent people have been prosecuted on evidence that is, quite frankly, really flimsy, and on these expert witnesses that have a lot of conflicts of interest, I guess you could say. Or
say that. I've called them frauds or quacks or charlatans.
So we could call them conflicts of interest or call them complete outright frauds. So talk about two of the people that you mainly focus your book on.
Right. So the book focuses on the two guys who kind of dominated the death investigation system in Mississippi for over 20 years. So one of them is Stephen Haines, who's the medical examiner, who did thousands and thousands of autopsies in Mississippi, way more than he should have been doing or that any doctor could competently do. And for Haines, he gave a lot of very questionable testimony that wasn't backed by science. But a lot of the problem with him was just sort of strictly volume, that he was doing way more than anybody could possibly do, which led to mistakes. There were cases where, he carefully noted the weight and appearance of a spleen in an inmate that had died of sepsis. Unfortunately, the inmate's spleen had been removed, a few years earlier. So those kinds of mistakes. His sidekick was this guy, Dr. Michael West, who was a dentist in Mississippi, and he became sort of the leading expert in the country on bite mark analysis in the 1990s. And bite mark analysis, you have the pattern matching fields of forensics, which are pretty dubious, and then bite mark analysis is dubious even within that field, and then West is dubious even within the field of bite mark experts. So we've got the sort of height of dubiousness was Dr. West, but he was very well respected in the 90s. He testified in a dozen states. Not just on bite mark evidence, but he really expanded his repertoire to include all sorts of what he called tool mark analysis. So he could claim that he could match the indentations on a woman's purse to, or the chain on a woman's purse to the indentations in a suspect's hand, or he could match a knife wound to a knife to the exclusion of all other knives on the planet.
And also we're talking about like weeks after the fact, him analysing people's hands in prison and saying, yes, 3 weeks ago I can tell that this exact butter knife was what was held in your hand by these indentations.
Right, and there's no science to back it up. It was, he claimed that only he could do this analysis. analysis, and it couldn't really be replicated, which again, not scientific, and again was also pretty convenient because then you were just going to have to take his word for it in these cases. But he, he put people in prison. He put people on death row, and in fact, to this day, there are there are 2 people on death row whose convictions Michael West contributed to, and there are 5 or 6 that Dr. Haines contributed to. So there's really been no effort in Mississippi to kind of deal with this problem in the comprehensive way I think that it needs to be handled.
So when I think of a court case, I think of respectable policemen who are trying to capture bad people, put them behind bars, and so we're relying on these witness testimonies to back up evidence and to make sure that we put the right people away. Now, what's actually happening is there's some perverse incentive structures. So people who are so-called expert witnesses end up either being unqualified or being fraudulent, and are sometimes even making a living by being a reliable witness for prosecutions, so that they know that, we can always call on this witness, they'll always be on our side, we can always get the outcome that we want. Tell me, some of the cases that you've witnessed about this.
Well, I mean, so in Mississippi, for example, on the topic of the book, when there was a suspicious death in Mississippi, the county coroner would take over the investigation, and then usually the prosecutor or the local police chief or sheriff would contract the body out to a private doctor for autopsy. Well, the problem with that is that when you're contracting out to a private doctor, if you're a prosecutor and you need the results to come back in a certain way in order to get a conviction, and the doctor comes back and says that's not the way it happened, or there's just not enough evidence for me to say that that's the way it happened ethically. If you're a corrupt prosecutor, you're just going to sort of egregiously cut that doctor out, and you're going to start using a doctor who gives you results you want. But what we found, and what I think is more probably what happened, is that I think even a conscientious prosecutor, I think, is going to be inclined to sort of go with somebody, as we all would, who makes our jobs easier, makes our work easier. And if you have a doctor who it doesn't have to be sort of a blatantly corrupt. I think it can more just be prosecutors are going to migrate to a doctor who, makes it easier for them to get convictions. And that's what Haines did. That's what West did. I mean, at one point, West even marketed he and Haines to prosecutors across Louisiana and Mississippi as the guys who can get you I believe the wording was the evidence you need to clinch a conviction. And, the interesting thing is Dr. West in particular never was able to generate leads or generate new suspects for prosecutors. He was the guy that they brought in when they already thought they knew who did it, but they just needed a little more evidence to get that person. And sure enough, he would always come in and find the guy that they wanted. In fact, the 2 cases that drive the book, West actually was brought in, and the guy who we know was the actual killer was one of the people who West took dental molds from and matched to the alleged bite marks that he found. They actually weren't even human bites, but and he excluded that person as the source of those bites and excluded that person as the possible culprit and ended up implicating the wrong person.
Goodness. You also spoke about a case where they, dug up this body and it was just a skeleton, and they had to ascertain whether or not that person had been strangled.
Right. Yeah, so that was the case. There was a skeletonized body found in the woods, no soft tissue on the body whatsoever. And this is a Haines case, and Dr. Haines testified at trial that the woman had been strangled to death. And if you talk to virtually any forensic pathologist, they'll tell you that there's no soft tissue on the body. There's no way to tell if somebody's been strangled. That's just not a conclusion that an ethical doctor could make.
It's crazy when you put it like that and you say, this isn't possible to make this conviction. It seems so obvious. But what actually happens in courtrooms? I mean, these judges are not experts in this. They have no way of knowing themselves unless they've studied in the field, or they have on hand all of these other sources, whether or not, something is actually feasible or possible. So you end up just having the prosecution quite often, far more often than we realize, bringing in expert witnesses that support their cases, and the judges just respecting the opinion, saying, oh, well, you're an expert, I'm not, I'm just going to believe this testimony.
Right. And this is a huge problem in the U.S. We've made judges the gatekeepers of science in the courtroom, and judges are trained to be lawyers. They're trained to look at the world as a lawyer does, not as a scientist does. And so what we find in these cases where there are these hearings on the scientific validity of expert testimony, the judges, their analysis reads like like a lawyer's analysis. They look at what other judges have done. They look at precedent. They look at previous cases. Science doesn't work that way. Science, if we want to know, if there's some new question in science that scientists want to explore, they don't look at what other scientists have already said. They do their own experiments. They add to the body of scientific knowledge. Our court system puts a premium on precedent, a premium on finality, a premium on consistency. Science is sort of always looking forward. The legal system is always looking backward. And so the two, science and law, have always been sort of at odds with each other. And we've never really figured out a good way to merge the two. And the problem really with forensics is that jurors want certainty. They want an expert witness who's going to say, this is how it happened, no question in my mind. And a good scientist isn't going to speak in those kinds of absolute terms. A good scientist is going to talk about probabilities and margin for error. And so it's actually the problem with judges just sort of letting everything in and letting our adversarial court system work it out, is that the kind of set of skills it takes to persuade a jury are not only are they not consistent with the set of skills it takes to be a good scientist, they're often at odds with one another. And so what we need scientists to be deciding what good and bad expertise is, what science or what expert testimony is allowed in the courtroom, because letting judges make that determination hasn't worked out well at all.
Now, there does seem to be something sort of insidious that does happen in courtrooms when you talk about cases like this. Like, what hope do you have for the future that we'll be able to change some of these practices and have, more finality, maybe relying more on DNA evidence rather than forensics, for example?
Well, I mean, DNA has helped, and in fact, DNA is science. It was developed in the scientific community. It has been subject to scientific inquiry and the scientific method. And what DNA did was it showed us that all these other forensic disciplines that we thought were reliable aren't. And DNA testing is why we're having this discussion right now. With DNA showed us that we get it wrong a lot, and that forensics experts have been getting it wrong way too often, and much more often than we thought. And
just lives have been ruined as a result. People, even when they've been in jail for 10 years and you find out this person actually was innocent, they're let out. It's celebrated as a victory, but it's not a victory if a person has lost 10 years of their life.
Correct. And the problem too, DNA, the thing about DNA is it's DNA testing, it's not a panacea. It's a wake-up call, but it's not a panacea. The percentage of cases for which DNA is dispositive of guilt is small. It's 10 to 15%. But the problems that DNA testing exposed in those cases for which it is dispositive of guilt undoubtedly exist throughout the entire criminal justice system. And if we don't sort of learn the lesson that we learned from that small pool of cases and apply it to the entire criminal justice system, at some point DNA is going to be used in all of those cases for which it's positive. There's going to be DNA testing done early on, and so there won't be any more mistakes in those cases. There will continue to be mistakes in all the other cases, but there will never be another something as profound as DNA to give us another wake-up call in the future. So we'll continue to make the mistakes. Innocent people will continue to go to prison. We just won't know about it, and that's pretty scary.
It's really scary, but thank you so much for all of the work that you've done in researching this and letting people know that this is happening and really unveiling a lot of the bad actors out there.
Thanks. My pleasure.
If you like my channel, please hit the like button and be sure to subscribe. I also have a Patreon account and wanted to give a special shout out to all the awesome people there. And a huge thank you to the sponsors of the show for making these videos possible. Thanks so much for watching.
She used to just party, go all the way.